Four-Way Review has partnered with writers to share a series of conversations on craft, exploring both the formation of specific scenes and the text as a whole. METTLEWORK, A Mining Daughter on Making Home by Jessica E. Johnson is a memoir of Johnson's unusual childhood during the 1970s and 80s, when she grew up in Mountain West mining camps and ghost towns, in places without running water or companions. These recollections are interwoven with the story of her transition to parenthood and post-recession Portland, Oregon. In METTLEWORK, Johnson digs through her mother's keepsakes, the histories of the places her family passed through, the language of geology, and a mothering manual from the early 20th century to uncover and examine the misogyny and disconnection that characterized her childhood world, a world linked to the present. But thinking about the mother's book, which helped frame some of the text and the ideas, is that, I guess, first off, is that a book that you had found yourself thinking about as you moved through adulthood, or was it only when you started to conceptualize this text or conceptualize parenthood that you found yourself returning to it?
I remembered it from my childhood as being like special. We did not have a lot of things. So the things that were, handed down were very meaningful. And anything, that my parents chose to carry around in these circumstances it was like a special thing to have. Um, and I was not a person who planned on being a parent particularly. It's not a way that I saw myself when I was growing up. And through much of my early adulthood, I thought it was something I would not want to do. um, and so the motherhood book was sort of like some of the other items in METTLEWORK, like kind of when I had the kids and I saw it, I was like, oh yeah, that. let's I remember that. What's in that? Memory and narrative come together in this book is in the idea of inheritance, the sense of inheriting a particular version of mothering and motherhood as a role. And so when I started to nurture someone, I started to feel this invisible inheritance and started to wonder what had I learned by being nurtured about nurturing. And there's this piece in the book that came out again in the like trimming for through line. And when I read this part out loud, I often miss this part that I took out. But I understand why it had to go. And I'm talking about my memories of our encampments or whatever. And it ends this way. I said, when I think of this time, my mother is almost never an image, but a feeling of immensity I traveled near and needed to stay close to. I long for changes in the weather, for snow, for sun, for the ominous darkness of a coming thunderstorm. I remember how my mother's changes could surprise me, how much a kind of providence she was, coming up with a song to break my boredom, her voice turning harsh in what seemed like a sudden loss of patience. But when I try to bring up a specific incident, a certain moment, there's only my own feeling, the color of a mood, not anything specific that she did. If I was a boat, she was the sea and sky, alternatives to her unthinkable. We talk constantly, but I can't recall what she said. She was my lens, too close for me to see. So that idea that she was my lens, and that because of that, I couldn't really see her, is this notion of having seen the world through someone else's narrative, like we do in families and in subcultures. And I think there's some of that that's always true between parents and children, but our isolation gave this phenomenon a really, I think, particular salience. And so in writing, there was this sense of trying to see or isolate this worldview that had raised me, and one that was, harming me in a sense in the present day because it didn't really have room for women or people who raise children to exist as full people. So artifacts and documents became a way to see the lens.
Why did you end up removing that section?
Is leading me, I think, so the earlier drafts, I would say the pre-2020 drafts, had kind of a focus on my mother as an enigma. And at some point, I really decided I wanted to let that piece of it go a bit and make it less about her and more about bigger stuff, I guess. Also, just on the like narrative craft level, I felt like it was one of those side streams. It was steering the through line toward about my mom when I needed it to be going somewhere else.
Thinking about your quote that even to intensely love one's children is to become painfully vulnerable to even the possibility of their loss. And then there's the grief for the self that can be lost in caregiving. Could you talk a little bit about the loss of the self in mothering? But I also think that there might be a tie in there to the loss of the self in narrative and
Oh,
going back
that's
to what
interesting.
what you were saying about seeing your mom as
Yeah.
the lens.
To me, the loss of self in mothering, there may be some like necessary or biological component, but what I think about most are the political dimensions of it. Um, we're very far as a country, and even in I live in a blue state. We're a long way from recognizing and upholding the full personhood of women, and a long way also from valuing children. And, if I think about all the ways that those values might be reflected in law and policy and culture and are not, then I think about how the self-displacement, I think, largely comes from that. It's not just that a person grows inside you and you expel them painfully. Then you're hormonally attuned to them in a way that troubles the sense of a coherent self. But for me, the larger problem is that none of that biology or labor is recognized as such in the organization of society. So most people who give birth have little to no paid leave. Childcare is astronomical, and the people who do childcare as a paid job make very little. Um, and when the labor of becoming a parent and giving birth and raising people is assumed to be an aspect of instinct and nature, instead of what I consider to be like an intense and socially important labor performed by people who are building a body of knowledge and praxis. It is no wonder it is no wonder that you feel um, like no one sees you as a coherent self, because the culture does not treat you as one, if that makes sense. If your needs are not reflected in the organization of society, um, how would you not become displaced from the sense of like this minimal sense of agency, that personal or collective, that is part of understanding the self as a self. And then in the book, too, in the chapter we're talking about, there's a long speech by Teddy Roosevelt that draws out these gender roles and the man who fuels and fights for the empire, the woman who turns her creative genius to the home so that the man can do that. And together they raise the next generation who will reproduce this arrangement. And I guess now I'm just going to go off. You can take it out later, but like this is the division of there's the division and subordination that ultimately serves capital and empire, I think, in my view. And it's sort of no wonder that that there's this attack on all sorts of things that the right sees as undermining the heteronormative family. Like the heteronormative family is the linchpin. So trans rights under attack, reading libraries, like all of these things. I think it's like this sort of desperate attempt to claw back the nuclear family, which essentially serves capital and empire.
Did you find while writing and making your way through the drafts that you had the desire to shield either yourself or those you were writing about? And then, if so, how did that desire shape how you were writing or how you revised?
Part of the shielding has to do with where you put the camera, um, and under what circumstances. And I think with creative nonfiction, we're always leaving a lot out anytime we take up the pen, just like sort of the camera can't be 360 and omnidirectional. It can't be omnidirectional. Um, Neither can the writer's view, so the view is always somewhat partial. But if I feel myself shying away from something that is relevant or something that is true, um, because it is painful or embarrassing, I do try to go back and examine that. There's no reason to do that. To do like there's no reason to write memoir or nonfiction in my view, except for if you don't want to tell yourself the truth, why do this? So that's kind of my metric is, and do I feel like I'm telling myself the truth here?
Was there always a plan or a desire to visit one of the mines? And then what was it about this visit or that process of the writing, the editing, that made you realize this was the moment to end the memoir with?
That whole episode was a total, it was completely unplanned. We were just at the cabin killing time and needed something to do, and that's what we ended up doing. So it was though, and at that point, I really didn't know what I was going to do with metalwork. I didn't know if I would publish it. I didn't know if I had another major revision in me. Um, and I was like, well, at least I can maybe get an essay out of this. And the experience itself just happened to be really like, oh, I feel like this essay is just writing itself. Um, and at the I stuck it at the end just to see how that would work. And I actually liked hearing from you that you felt like it was a good ending because I was a little worried that it would be um, a little far from the tone of the books since I had written it a good deal later than a lot of the book. So I'm glad to hear that it makes a satisfying ending.